A.J. Congress, The Political Future of American Jews, by Earl Robb and Seymour Martin Lipset, American Jewish Congress, 15 East 84th Street, New York, New York 10028. About the authors. Earl Robb, a communal relations specialist, is Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of San Francisco. Seymour Martin Lipset, a political sociologist, is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Page 1. The Political Future of American Jews. American Jews are a politically effective group within certain limits and are probably at the peak of their political influence. The question is whether that effectiveness is threatened by developing changes in American political life, in world affairs, or in American Jewish circumstances. The auxiliary question is whether such changes call for adjustments in American Jewish strategy. Preview of factors. The factors to which Jewish political effectiveness is usually ascribed fall into several categories. There is the voting pattern of American Jews, which has traditionally emphasized two factors: the Jewish population concentration in certain urban voting districts, compounded by the high voting rate of American Jews. Those factors have been seen to give Jews a somewhat disproportionate mechanical leverage in political influence, but are usually associated with another set of factors having to do with Jewish political activism. Such activism includes a high level of financial contribution to political campaigns, and a high level of energy involvement in political life in electoral campaigns, in the policy and strategy councils of aspirant politicians, and of elected public officials. A more complex and less invoked set of factors relates to the nature of that activism in the non-Jewish community. There is a high level of integration in business and community life in general, creating circles of access and influence which extend into the political arena, and coalition formation with other groups, which often critically multiplies the political effect of the Jews. However, none of these factors would have sharp political point without some internal corporate factors, a certain issue intensiveness, a heavy communal consensus on a couple of high-agenda items, and a Jewish organizational strength through which these consensus positions are formally presented to policymakers. However, in addition to the overwhelming consensus on several prime issues of Jewish concern, there have been some other strong attitudinal tendencies among American Jews, as a group, on subjects of social welfare, for example, which have shaped the strength of Jewish involvement in certain political coalitions. Partly as a result of these attitudinal patterns, American Jews have found their greatest political leverage within a coalition of the Democratic Party. Page 2. All these factors, patterns of voting, activism, integration, and issue intensity, are interrelated and cumulative in effect. There is, however, one other large factor outside that system: objective conditions which affect the perceived concordance of American values and Jewish values. At best, Jewish political influence is marginal. There are, and have been, points beyond which a maximally effective Jewish effort could not prevail, especially to the extent that it embraces a persuasive intellectual focus. Jewish political activity can help shape the concordance and, to some extent, the objective conditions which affect it. If those are the factors which have comprised American Jewish political influence, there are certain perceived changes taking place which would seem likely to affect them: Jewish demographic changes, financial and other electoral reform and changes in the American political process, changes in Jewish attitudes and institutions, and changes in objective circumstances. Jewish voting and Jewish population movement. While Jewish population statistics are inexact, there is convincing evidence that American Jews are both diminishing in proportion and dispersing outwards, from inner cities and large cities. The Jewish population percentage in America probably dropped from about 2.7% in 1970 to about 2.5% in 1980. And if median population projections hold up, that will drop further by 2000. But Jewish voting strength has never depended on sheer numbers, but rather on concentration and voting zeal. And the traditional rule of thumb has been to multiply Jewish voting age figures by a factor of 2 in general elections to arrive at the percentage of Jews in the voting population. That 2-to-1 ratio varies, of course, and may usually range a bit lower. If, for example, 85% of the Jewish voting age population votes at a time when 50% of the general voting age population votes, the rate is 1.7. There are 9 states, counting the District of Columbia as a state for presidential voting purposes, in which the Jews comprise 3% or more of the population, from 10.6% in New York to 3.2% in California. These states have 182 of the 270 electoral votes needed to elect a president. Applying the hypothetical ratio of 1 to 7% to those estimated populations, the Jewish voting percentages range from about 18% in New York to about 5% in California, Table 1. In the 1980 and 1984 elections, at the most hypothetical, that range of Jewish voting strength did not provide the margin of Democratic victory anywhere, and could only have reversed the Republican victories in a couple of states if Jews had voted 90 to 10 Democratic. Page 3. Emerging from such hypothetical exercises is the reality that the mechanical margin of Jewish votes is rarely going to make a critical difference. Sharpening that reality is the fact that the direction of Jewish voting has always corresponded to the direction of general voting, Table 1, so that, for example, a massive 90 to 10 differential in Jewish voting is not liable to occur unless there is also an unusually large differential in general Democratic Party voting. That reduces the practical significance of the Jewish voting differential. There are qualifications. For example, the rule of thumb is to apply a factor of at least 3 to the Jewish voting population to find the proportion of Jewish voters in the Democratic Party primaries. These can more often become significant margins. However, the fact remains that, apart from Democratic Party primaries in certain key states and the election of a few key congressmen from a few districts dominated by heavy Jewish population, the Jewish voting population per se is rarely a decisive factor in American national politics. Of course, political candidates in close races and in Jewish populous states cannot afford to overlook the possibility of such a rare occurrence. In 1976, the Jewish voters did provide the margin by which Carter took New York, and New York did provide the electoral margin by which he took the presidency. But that has happened only once. And in the last 7 congressional elections, only about 5% of the candidates were elected in Jewish populous states, with less than 55% of the vote, so the Jewish vote was not critical. In short, while the marginal Jewish voting power has occasionally some significance, it does not in itself explain the influence of American Jews in politics, and, by the same token, the diffusion of Jewish population is not by itself a seriously negative factor in that influence. In matter of fact, while population estimates between 1955 and 1982 show a significant drop in a couple of the key states, Table 1, the overall pattern does not threaten a radical collapse in state concentrations. More to the point is the estimate that the percentage of Jews in cities of 500,000 or more decreased from 84% to 72% during the 1980s. However, if the influence of the Jewish population depend, then on their numerical presence at the polls, then this kind of centrifugal dispersion can be a positive factor. In a sense, the spread of Jewish political activism away from the population centers follows the general spread of political power. For example, Baltimore's share of Maryland's presidential vote declined from 48 to 17% between 1940 and 1980. In that same period, New York City's share dropped from 51 to 31%. The Jewish movement from some of the major cities may actually be a productive dispersion. Page 4. Financial contributions and electoral fund reform. If the Jewish disproportion in general national elections is to be multiplied by a factor of about 2, then the disproportion of Jewish financial contributions to national political campaigns must be multiplied by a factor of 15 to 20. While there have been few reliable statistics on the subject, and some reluctance to gather any, the journalistic and anecdotal evidence is overwhelming that more than a majority of Democratic funds on a national level, and as much as a quarter of Republican funds have come from Jewish sources. In 1968, for example, 21 individuals advanced Hubert Humphrey $100,000 or more for his campaign. 15 of them were Jews. That kind of financial participation had been typical. The disproportionate level of Jewish voting reflected a strong sense of Jewish self-interest in public affairs and a relatively high middle-class educated level of activism. The disproportionate level of political contributions reflected those factors and more. Since the end of World War II, Jews comprised a relatively affluent group and markedly included a number of individuals and families who were affluent for the first time, a famously good class of givers. There had long been a tradition of philanthropic giving, at least among Western Jews, dating back to the Middle Ages, to community needs shaped by adversity and legitimated by Jewish religious tradition. And Jewish political needs in this country have been perceived as a communal need, like philanthropy. But beyond that, Political involvement has been a means by which many new rich in America have been able to gain quick community recognition and general influence. Political campaigning has, of course, become increasingly expensive with the growth of the population and the advent of television. In 1976, for example, winning congressmen spent about $63 million, and in 1982 about $195 million, an increase roughly twice the inflation factor. There is no automatic relationship between campaign spending and political victory. In the 1980 congressional races, half of the top 10 spenders won and half lost. Of the 9 Democrats who lost in that campaign, 7 had a spending advantage. However, spending on occasion does make the difference, and it is a firm article of belief among candidates that money is the mother's milk of politics. Thus, political contributors have had, if not control and if not patronage, at least heightened access to their candidates. Financial contributions are a much more certain and bankable political item than Jewish voting margins in most cases, and Jewish political effectiveness has been less closely tied to voting margins than to the page 5 access which has been gained by Jewish contributors to campaigns. The question is whether electoral finance reform of recent years has undercut that source of effectiveness. The more than $100,000 contributions that were made through the early 1970s, the individual Jewish advances made to Humphrey went as high as $390,000, are no longer possible. But so far, these restrictions on individual contributions do not seem to pose a crippling disability to Jewish political effectiveness. According to one expert on campaign financing, the role of the wealthy has not been diminished by the reforms. The main effect, he said, has been to exchange the big giver for the big solicitor, Herbert Alexander, quoted in the Wall Street Journal, October 24, 1984, page 1. Solicitation by the wealthy from the wealthy has been a particular Jewish tradition and a skill sharpened in philanthropic campaigns. And such bundling of funds can still be raised in amounts significant enough to warrant access. The legal limit of $1,000 per individual giver per election can be multiplied by the number of one's relatives, and by the channeling of donations to funds and committees, other than the candidate's direct campaign. The political action committees are simply legal and convenient fund repositories for many political groups such as industrial associations, but for groups like the Jews, they are also very useful vessels for the kind of bundling and financial negotiation which are currently called for. There are over 30 PACs which are specifically geared to supporting congressional candidates who are favorable to Israel. In the congressional campaign of 1982, these PACs contributed a total of $1.67 million, a little more than half going to senatorial candidates. In the congressional campaign of 1983 to 84, that amount probably doubled. In short, while some Jewish heavy hitters have been hobbled insofar as their personal contributions are concerned, many Jews have maintained their access by dint of their fundraising activities, and the Jewish contributions have even more of a Jewish communal tinge than they had before. On that level, there is no indication that the electoral fiscal reforms have impeded Jewish effectiveness in politics. However, there may be some clouds on the horizon relating primarily to PACs. First of all, there is the question of whether PACs, becoming the prime contribution instrument of Jews, are so stringently one issue in nature that they will distort or weaken the integrated position of American Jews in the political process. That question will be addressed later. More directly, there is the question of whether current methods will lead, in a kind of backlash effect, to electoral reform of a kind which could be more disabling to the Jewish pattern. Page 6. Some observers have described PACs as a scandal waiting to happen. Congressman Glickman, talking about the problem of PACs, said, "Study after study has shown a very high correlation between funds received and the way some key votes have been cast." Congressional Record House, July 8, 1981, H. 4101. Most of these high correlations carrying the potential of scandal involve direct economic interest. Notoriously, in 1982, when the House Energy and Finance Committee voted to overturn a Federal Trade Commission regulation, which the auto dealers opposed, 26 out of the 27 committee members had received contributions totaling $84,000 from the National Auto Dealers Association, and all but one voted for the auto dealer's position. That kind of situation has been repeated again and again. Of course, the correlation has been frequently rationalized by the statement that funds are given not to coerce a congressman's opinion, but to strengthen congressmen who already have the right opinion. But that distinction is often enough suspect, certainly in the eyes of the citizenry. When Congressman Dan Glickman of Kansas asked another congressman to join him in an action unfavorable to the auto dealers, he was told, "I'm committed. I got a $10,000 check from the National Automobile Dealers Association. I can't change my vote now." Brooks Jackson, Wall Street Journal, March 5, 1984. Under current law, presidential candidates are eligible for substantial federal funding support and are limited in the amount they can spend. Congressional candidates do not get government funding support and are unlimited in expenditures. Congressman Henry Roos of Wisconsin said that the corruption and the evil is not only in people seeming to sell access, or in some cases even their vote. It lies in the preoccupation of legislators, who have to spend a large part of their lives panhandling, going around to all of these groups saying, "I would just love to have a check from you." That shouldn't be. At the moment, there seems to be little political likelihood that Congress will move towards laws which make their campaigns predominantly dependent on government funding. If, however, the corruption and evil to which Congressman Roos referred broke out by way of public scandal or public outrage at escalating campaign costs, then a movement towards public funding might become more feasible. In that case, it is more likely that the possibility of access by the Jewish community through the means of political contributions would be reduced. Jewish activism and changes in the political process. Disproportionate voting is, of course, an index of political activism. Disproportionate financial contribution to campaigns is an instrument, page 7, as well as an index of political activism. But Jewish political activism extends beyond both phenomena and is bedded in an even larger field of social activism. Social activism describes a high level of participation in the affairs of the general community. It can be measured in terms of disproportionate Jewish membership and leadership in most of the communal activities which are open to them. Business and trade associations, professional associations, trade unions, student political organizations, artistic associations, general welfare associations, all of those groups which comprise the associational arena of American community life. There are countless theories about this general Jewish activism. There is the obvious matter of educational level and middle-class status, and of the emerging group syndrome, both of which may stimulate special desires for involvement and community recognition. However, there is also a theory that an additional factor exists among Jews. A prevalently high level of achievement drive, drawn presumably out of the Jewish life experience, but over and above the factors mentioned above. For example, one attempt to measure achievement drive and relate it to ethnicity found that for Protestants, for Italians, for Greeks, for blacks, the lower socioeconomic group, in each group registered a significantly lower achievement drive than the middle class of that group. Only in the case of the Jews were those results reversed, the Jewish lower class registering a slightly higher score than the middle class. One social psychologist, after reviewing the evidence, wrote, "In short, there is very little doubt the average achievement score, among Jews, is higher than for the general population in the United States at this time." McClelland. Whatever the reasons, there is a demonstrably high level of Jewish participation in the various channels of American community life. This general social activism preceded political activism, and is in aid of it. By dint of it, Jewish individuals have become influentials in the general community. As often as not, these influentials as a consequence have become political influentials. Further, this integrating process has created, by natural means, a great deal of interfacing between participant Jews and various other groups and circles of influence in the community. That interfacing is the beginning of the coalition process. This active integration of the Jews is at the heart of their political effectiveness. On one level, it is in itself a persuasive factor for many of the Jewish agenda items. On a top agenda item, American support of Israel, for example, this factor plays a substantial role. The basis of American support for Israel is the prevalent American perception that the support of Israel is important for American national interest. The chief engine of that perception of Israeli importance to America is